Hi, I want to talk to you today about Anselm of Canterbury, and in particular, what made him most famous, the ontological argument. In fact, probably most contemporary philosophers know one thing about Anselm, and that is the ontological argument. As we'll see in a series of videos, there are actually several arguments in Anselm. There is the Proslogion 2 argument, the most famous one, the one that has really concentrated philosophers' minds throughout the century on the question of whether it's possible to prove God's existence a priori from the concept of God alone. But there's another argument, arguably, in Proslogion 3, a modal argument, to supplement that initial argument. And then in the Autologion, he offers a rather different argument, one that has received relatively little attention, but I think underlies some of the concepts in Kurt Gödel's proof of the existence of God that he wrote in the 1940s. So today I want to talk about the ontological argument, specifically in Proslogion 2, the really famous one. Before we get into the details of that, I want to point out that Anselm himself, an 11th century thinker, is a huge advance philosophically, and someone who seemingly comes out of nowhere. The last great philosopher before him was Augustine, writing 500 years before. And so seemingly, you might say, throughout the Dark Ages, there was almost no philosophy being done in Western Europe at all. But the philosophical tradition was kept alive in the monasteries. Anselm himself was educated at Bec in France. He became Archbishop of Canterbury. And that itself is remarkable, but keep in mind that everything being done in intellectual circles and in the circles of the church was done in Latin. So it was no problem to go from one French-speaking country to an English-speaking country, or at least Middle French and Middle English. Everybody who was doing anything in intellectual or in theological spheres was doing it in Latin. Well, let's talk specifically about the ontological argument. It is ontological. Ontology is the study of being, the study of what there is. And so this is a question of God's existence. You might say every question about the existence of God is ontological. But this one is remarkably sparse. It starts from the concept of God alone and builds an argument on the basis of that. So let's see how Anselm tries to do it. When we look at it, I think it's important to keep in mind that the Proslogion is done in an unusual sort of style. It is really a prayer. And it is mostly addressed in the second person. That is to say, it is Anselm talking to God. So he himself is not going to insist, really, that he has, in some objective sense, proved God's existence. He says, I am trying to understand your nature. And so there is a sense in which this has an unusual context. He is speaking to God directly, trying to understand God, not really in the sense that his understanding will produce belief, but instead the idea is that belief will lead to understanding. Let's take a look at the argument. Robert Hartman in 1961 said Proslogion 2 through 4 consist of 4 pages. Karl Barth's book about them in 1931 has 165 pages. All the books and essays written about them in the last 800 years would fill libraries. It's a legitimate question to ask. What is it in these 4 pages in Anselm that makes them so potent a challenge to the best minds of humanity? What is the spell they cast over the reader so the occupation with them becomes a passionate enterprise? These pages don't seem to have the completeness and remoteness of a classic. They seem to call on the reader personally to do something about them. They arouse in him an intellectual passion, either for or against them, which makes him feel that the core of his own thinking is being touched. On the one hand, they seem so concise that nothing can be added. On the other, so loose that everything still has to be done. But what? The reader feels puzzled, teased, imposed upon. He feels called to take a personal part in a Herculean intellectual struggle. Well, let's take our part in that struggle. The ontological argument is, keep in mind, made in the context of a prayer. And so here is the way it goes. He says, indeed, again, speaking to God, we believe you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. Often people will say, can be conceived. The Latin is capable of both interpretations. Or is there, then, no such nature as you? For the fool is said in his heart, that God does not exist. Here is referring to the Psalms and to a passage in which it says, the fool says in his heart, God does not exist. Surely that very same fool hears my words something than which nothing greater can be thought. He understands what he hears, for what he understands is in his understanding, even if he doesn't understand, that is to say, judge it to exist. For that a thing is in the understanding is distinct from understanding that it exists. For example, when a painter envisions what he's about to paint, he indeed has in his understanding that which has not yet been made, but he doesn't yet understand that it exists. His task is to make it exist. But after he's painted it, he has in his understanding that which he has made, and he understands that it exists. So even the fool is convinced that something than which nothing greater can be thought is at least in his understanding. For when he hears of this being, he understands what he hears, and whatever is understood is in the understanding. Now, so far, Anselm is really just saying there is a distinction between existing in the understanding, in other words, being intelligible, having some concept of a thing, something that could, let's say, exist. Now, some things we don't really even have a concept of. Arguably, anything that is logically inconsistent, we don't really have a concept of. The round square, for example. Or the thing that is red all over and black all over. Or the thing that is both black and not black entirely at the same time. You might say, look, those things don't really make sense. I don't really have a concept. I understand the words have a meaning. But on the other hand, I can form no intellectual conception of what that would be like. He says, the fool does. The fool says, okay, I understand what you mean about God. I deny that God exists. The fool here, in other words, is simply the atheist who says, look, I understand what you mean when you say God exists. I deny it. And what he is saying is that makes no sense. But so far, all we have is the distinction. It's one thing for something to exist in the understanding. In other words, for something to be there as a concept, for it to be intelligible, for us to have some concept, some understanding of what it would be for that thing to exist. And another thing for it to actually exist and be understood as, be conceived as, be thought of as existing. In fact, we really have three things there. Something that I understand what it would be if it did exist, I conceive of it as actually existing, and then its actual existence. And we'll come back to that. But Anselm continues, surely that than which a greater cannot be thought, cannot be only in the understanding. For if it were only in the understanding, it could be thought to exist also in reality, something which is greater than existing only in the understanding. Therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be thought were only in the understanding, then that than which a greater cannot be thought would be that than which a greater can be thought. But surely that's impossible. Hence, without doubt, something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the understanding and in reality. Well, let's tease apart the structure of Anselm's argument. It's actually an extremely simple argument, one that has the appearance, at any rate, of a valid argument. Is that right? Well, we'll have to see. We'll have to tease it apart more carefully. And also, then we can ask, is it sound? If it is valid, are the premises true? So let's take each bit in turn. First of all, let's just look at it on its face. What are Anselm's premises? What's his conclusion? Here's the first premise. God is that the greater than which cannot be thought, the greater than which cannot be conceived. God, in other words, is the greatest conceivable being. Imagine a sphere of things, all of which I can conceive of. I can think about these things. They are things where I understand what it would be for them to exist. I may think they exist, I may not be sure, but at least I have the concept of what it would be for them to exist. Now, he says, God is the greatest of those. God is at the very top of that heap of possible objects, conceivable objects. Let's come back to that. We should be careful. Is conceivability the same as possibility? Well, no. Possibility is a metaphysical thing that has to do with the nature of the object itself and whether it can exist. Conceivability is whether I can think of it. I can form a concept of it. Philosophers have tended to think there's a link between those two things. But we should be careful because that link might not be as obvious as it seems at first glance. Now, Anselm's way of characterizing God here as that, the greater than which cannot be conceived, is something that is a definition of God. It's really, he thinks, constitutive of the concept of God. And so if we're to understand this as a definition, first of all, we have to accept that God can be defined. Aquinas gets off the boat right at this point and says, I don't think God can be defined. I don't think God's nature is something we can fully grasp. And so he ends up saying right away, no, I can't give you a definition of God. And I don't think anyone can. But Anselm thinks it is possible to define God as the greatest conceivable being. Well, any definition requires two things for it to be secure. We have to show that such an object exists, and we have to show that that object is unique in order to define a singular term like the thing, the greater than which cannot be conceived, the greatest possible being. Well, he thinks he's already established that such a being exists. Not exists in reality, mind you, but exists in the understanding. The fool understands the word God when he hears it. The atheist says, I don't think God exists. And in saying that is using the term God as if it were intelligible. In other words, the atheist's position is, look, I have the concept of God. I deny there is any such real being. And so admits that there is a concept of God, that God's existence is something that is at least conceivable. Well, then he thinks he's got existence in the mind, in the understanding, because even the atheist is going to say, yeah, I understand what you mean, I just deny that that being exists. Even an agnostic typically says, yes, I understand what you mean, and I have no idea whether such a being exists. And so Anselm's point is not so far presupposing that God exists, but that God exists in the understanding, as he puts it. In other words, that God is conceivable. Now, what about the uniqueness? Why should we assume that there is one thing at the top of that sphere of conceivable beings, so that we can get the greatest conceivable being, as opposed to just one of the greatest conceivable beings? That is harder to understand. Notice he says that than which the greater cannot be conceived. There might be many things, the greater than which cannot be conceived. Now, in the end, I think he thinks there's a very simple argument for this. Suppose that there were more than one thing that really were such that they were at the top of the heap and you could conceive of nothing greater. Well, think of something with their combined power, their combined knowledge, their combined wisdom, their combined greatness. Wouldn't that be even greater than all of them? At least you could think there's some way of putting the maximal points together to get one maximal point. And I think that's lying behind his thought. You think there's more than one such being? Well, put them together. Now, if their excellences are really incompatible with one another, maybe you can't put them together. So I think there is an underlying thought here, and a real assumption, which is that the various perfections, not just the perfections of God, but the perfections of anything, ultimately are consistent, that a perfect being would exhibit all the perfections, and those perfections could exist together. If that's not true, if there are various perfections such that really you'd have to choose between this one and that one, so that you couldn't have both, then there might be something, for example, that excels in wisdom, and something that excels in power, but there would be some kind of incompatibility, so you couldn't put the greatest wisdom and the greatest power together. Anselm thinks there is no such incompatibility. All those excellences, all those perfections are in the end compatible. But if so, he thinks, then there is a single greatest conceivable being. The second premise is that than which no greater can be thought can't exist just in the mind. Now suppose it did. Suppose this being existed in the understanding, but not in reality. Anselm says, then I can think of something greater, something just like this being, but existing in reality. So take all those perfections, the ultimate power, the ultimate wisdom, the ultimate knowledge, and now put them together, but also put them together with existence. That is a concept of a being greater than a being perfect in power, perfect in wisdom, perfect in knowledge, but non-existent. And so he says, look, if that being didn't exist in reality, I could think of something greater, namely something just like that being, but existing. And so the greatest conceivable being wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being at all. Conclusion, God exists in reality. We're going to look in a separate video at Gaunilo's objection to that argument. Gaunilo was a contemporary of Anselm, a monk, who responded by saying, I don't think this argument works at all. If it did work, it would allow us to prove the perfect island's existence, the perfect anything's existence. And there are many other objections that have been raised against this argument that we'll look at. But for the moment, I want to focus on one particular kind of objection. You might say there's a fundamental distinction between existing in reality and being conceived of as existing in reality, being thought to exist. There are many things we probably conceive of existing in reality that don't really exist. Now, of course, we don't know what they are because we think of them as existing in reality. But all we have to do is look back at the history of science, for example, or at the history of popular culture, the history of common people's opinions, superstitions, and so on, to realize there are lots of things that people have conceived of as existing that actually didn't exist. Phlogiston, for example, or witches. Those are things that didn't really exist, but on the other hand, people conceived of them as existing. There are also things, probably, that exist right now that we don't conceive of existing. Maybe we don't conceive of them at all, or maybe we do conceive of them, but we don't really think they exist. So we conceive of the abominable snowman, maybe, but we think, oh, such a being doesn't exist. But suppose the Yeti is found, then we'd say, oh, well, we conceived of him as not existing, but actually he does exist. There's been a debate historically about whether King Arthur is mythical or whether there really was a King Arthur. I think the tendency now in history is to think there really was, though we know relatively little about him. Most of the stories really are legends. Well, in any case, we can argue about things like that and think, I'm not sure whether this thing should be conceived as existing in reality or not. But of course, it really does exist in reality, or at least did, or it doesn't. And so, in the end, we say there's a difference. We can have things that exist in reality that we don't conceive of as existing, but we can also conceive of as existing some things that don't really exist. Well, once we distinguish those two things, let's look at the details of Anselm's argument. The crucial premise, and really there are two, after all, is it really true that God's existence is even possible? Can we conceive of God's existence? It might be that we can't, but we'll come back to that question. Let's focus initially on this question of the second premise. The claim is that the greater than which cannot be thought must exist in reality as well as the understanding. If it existed in the understanding alone, we could conceive of something greater, namely that being but actually existing. Well, to get the conclusion that God exists in reality, we need to say it's a greater concept if that being exists in reality. But now we might worry, well, wait, its existing in reality has nothing to do with the content of our concept. Instead, what has to do with the content of the concept is me conceiving of it as existing in reality, or conceiving of it as not existing in reality, or possibly existing, possibly not. In short, it's a question of whether I conceive of that being as having existence. But that seems independent of the question of whether the being actually exists. So one criticism that I take very seriously of this argument is to say, look, really, if we're to support that second premise and say, I can conceive of something greater, namely a being like that, but as existing, I'm saying the being that would have all perfections and is conceived as actually existing, that would be a content in the realm of conceivable objects that would be actually greater than a being with all those perfections, but I conceive of as not existing. Or maybe existing. that would be a greater conception. I'm conceiving it as existing. But that just shows that I have to conceive of God as existing. That is to say that a being with all perfections would be one that is conceived as existing. That seems to fall short of establishing that being actually exists in reality. So one way that Aquinas, for example, objects, and that many people have objected to this argument, is to say that it somehow leaps from the realm of ideas to the realm of reality. And the distinction I've just drawn indicates why you might think that. All I've really done, according to that view, is show that in order to understand the concept of God, in order to understand what God even is, I have to conceive of that being as existing. But that falls short of showing that God exists in reality outside my mind. It just shows that I can't stop myself from thinking of God as existing. Now, is that enough? Anselm, remember, is doing this in the context of a prayer. So Anselm might actually be willing to accept that conclusion. To say that is, I'm already believing that God exists. I'm trying to understand what God is, something about God's nature. And what I find out is that God's nature is such that if I understand it, I have to think of God as existing. So the fool who says, I understand what you mean about God, I don't think God exists, that fool is mistaken. That fool is in some way really a fool, as he puts it, or in other words, really doesn't have the concept of God at all. Because if the fool, if the atheist, if the agnostic really understood the concept of God, then would understand that you have to conceive of God as existing. You can't say, yes, I understand what you mean by God, but I deny that being exists. You can't even say, I understand what you mean by God, but I'm not sure if that being exists. You have to think of God as existing if you are even to understand the concept of God. So, there's a sense in which Anselm, in trying to refute this fool, the agnostic or the atheist, really can rest content with this, saying, I admit, maybe I haven't proved the existence of God in reality, but I have proved that the atheist, the agnostic, has to say, I don't even understand what you mean in talking about God. I don't even have this in my understanding. Because if I did, I would have to agree with you. I would have to conceive of God as existing, but I can't do it, so I actually recognize I don't even understand the concept of God. I don't have the concept of God you have, because if I did, I would have to actually accept that I have to conceive of that being as existing. Well, if that's right, then in one sense, Anselm has disappointed us. Anselm's argument really doesn't prove that God exists in reality. But on the other hand, he would have done something important. Say, you can't claim to have the concept of God and understand what people are talking about when they talk about God, but deny or even question God's existence. So in that sense, the position of the atheist or the agnostic is really untenable. Now, that's only one possible kind of objection one might raise, and one defense one might try to make of Anselm's argument. We're going to move on to look at the modal argument in the next section of the Proslogion. We'll also look at his monological argument, and we'll look at a variety of other objections that have been raised against this argument to see whether they point out serious problems and whether there's some way of patching up the ontological argument to solve them.